everyone, so here is your ablative use video. It's going to review every use of the ablative that we have learned and hopefully help you on your final exam. So, first use of the ablative is the prepositional phrase. So, prepositional phrases are probably the easiest ablative to identify. You need two things. First thing, you have to have a noun in the ablative, as you would expect for a use of the ablative. The second thing is you need a preposition. So the preposition, based on its name, is a preposition, so it's a word that will come before that noun, and it is probably one of three prepositions, maybe four prepositions. So you have in, ex, and ob are the most common, and sometimes cum or another one, but we'll get to that in a second. So, in means in, as you would expect. So, in the nighttime, for instance. Ex means out of. It could also be just an E, just like ob can be just an A. So, out of the temples, eides. Or ob means from or away from. So, from the city. Cum, you can have either a cum clause, which takes a subjunctive, or you can have cum as a preposition and it just means with. So for instance, if you have cum manibus, that means with hands. So that is how those work. So prepositional phrase has a preposition and then an ablative. Should be the easiest one to identify. Make sure you know what a preposition is. If you don't know, there's a lot of good Schoolhouse Rock videos about this, so please feel free to check them out. All right, that's one use. Okay, next use is separation. So if you have an ablative of separation, you can really only tell from context in the sentence. Remember, none of these ablatives show up on their own. They're used to communicate meaning in a Latin sentence. So you have to know what the sentence means sometimes to determine what type of ablative you have. Prepositional phrase, very obvious. If you have a preposition and then an ablative, it's a prepositional phrase. But separation, you need to know some of the words around the ablative to figure out what's going on. So for instance, we have natus Ioe. Remember, Ioe is a form of Jupiter. So natus means having been born. Sorry, hold on. Okay, we're back. So natus means having been born, and you are born from someone, in this case, Jupiter. So having been born from Jupiter. So ablative of separation, if you're born from someone, you are being separated from them. Next, we have dominatione liberatus. So liberatus means having been freed from domination or from tyranny, something like that. So you're freed from something or from someone, and that's an idea of separation. Last but not least, remember that towns and cities and one-town islands can be used in just the ablative to emphasize separation. So you don't need an ob, or an ex. Ob or ex are unnecessary if it's a city. You can just have the ablative on its own, emphasizing separation. So if you just see Roma in a sentence, it means away from Rome. So if you want to say, I go away from Rome, you could say, proficiscor, I set forth from Rome, Roma. So proficiscor Roma means I go forth from Rome. All right, next type of ablative we have, not super common, but you see it once in a while, is the ablative of comparison. So the ablative of comparison is used to compare two things, as you would expect. The first thing is whatever case makes sense in the sentence. The second thing is in the ablative. So, our example of that one is just the example they give you in the book because I couldn't think of a better one. So this one's malleus unda. So malleus, comparative. Remember you have IOR or IUS in the neuter. So here it would be a neuter form. So softer than water, unda, in the ablative. So if I want to say prettier than a rose, for instance, rose in Latin rosa would be in the ablative. Prettior, pulcherior, for instance, or pulcheriora, rosa in the ablative. So comparative, adjective or adverb, and then a noun in the ablative usually indicates ablative of comparison. You won't have one of these on your final, but it's good to know about if you want to continue on in Latin. Next use you do see all the time, and we talk about it a bunch, is the locative and temporal. So this is ablative of time as you know it. So it's called locative because sometimes it refers to places, most commonly in the phrase terra marique. So this is by land and by sea in English, that famous phrase, or on land and on sea. For instance, the Roman forces were fighting on land and on sea. That would be an ablative, a locative ablative specifically because you're talking about the place in which they were doing something. But more common for our purposes is the ablative of time, which is these two. So you have tribis oris, within 3 hours, and then you have illo die, on that day. So ablative of time expresses time within which or at which something happens. So something happens within those 3 hours or on that day specifically. So if you have a time word in the ablative, chances are very good you have an ablative of time. So day, hour, night, week, month, anything like that, ablative of time. Next we have the ablative of agent. So ablative of agent is another one that's really, really easy to identify. You should never get this one confused because it always looks the same. So you always have a or ab, depending on whether the word starts with a vowel or not, and then a person in the ablative. So it's necessary that you remember that ablative of agent is always a person. It is an agent doing something. So you have something is done, a passive verb, something is done by a or ab, a person in the ablative. So my example here, which I just wrote up, is he, she, it is loved, amator in the passive, by me. Someone is loved by me. So in this case, a or ab does not mean from, it means by a person doing something. Okay, so you always have a or ab. You have an ablative person and you have a passive verb. If you have those three things, you have an ablative of agent. Ablative of means is pretty similar, but it doesn't have a or ab. So it's again, ablative of means, usually used with a passive verb, not always, but often with a passive verb, but this is a thing rather than a person, and there is no a or ab. So no a or ab, and a thing rather than a person. So for instance, he, she, it is caught by means of swords. So you can translate it by means of or just by swords, but there's no word a or ab, and it's a thing. So swords are just an inanimate object, and therefore they're means, rather than if you said it is seized by soldiers, for instance, you'd have capitur a militibus, by soldiers, with an a or ab. Okay, ablative of manner is very similar to means, but usually it's not a physical object so much as an idea. For instance, if you wanted to say, he came with the greatest swiftness is in the ablative, or you could say they seized the town by means of speed, claritate. So you could envision it as a type of means. It is really just an ablative of means, but there's nothing physical, like you can't hold on to swiftness. It's just an idea. So it's called manner instead of means. But manner and means basically look the same, and you can translate it as either, and I will be happy. Okay, the last big use of any type of ablative is the ablative absolute. So these are probably the most important for you to recognize because they're a little bit harder to find. So usually they're set off by commas, which is helpful, and usually they're 2 words or more. You never find a 1-word ablative absolute. So you either have 2 nouns or you have a noun and a participle. So here's how they look. You have 2 words in the ablative that agree with each other. So first example I have here is the example of 2 nouns that are both in the ablative. So you have with Tullius as consul. So those are 2 nouns both in the ablative setting up an ablative absolute. The other option is to have a noun and a participle that agree and are both in the ablative setting up an ablative absolute. So here you have with the city having been captured. So you'll have two words, both in the ablative, either a participle and a noun or two nouns. You might have other words that also agree with these, but you have to have at least this basic amount in order to have an ablative absolute. Okay. The idea of an ablative absolute is that it stands apart from the sentence, so you can take it out and it expresses some idea on its own. It's not part of the grammar of the actual sentence. So it's not being used in any other way as an ablative, it's standing on its own together with its other word. Great. Okay. The last thing I want to say is that some verbs also take the ablative. Don't worry about that for your final, but just be aware of it if you happen to see them when you are reading Latin for fun, as I'm sure you will all do this summer. Some verbs do take the ablative, and it'll tell you in the dictionary that they take the ablative. Okay, I hope this was helpful. Let me know if you want any other review videos. I'm very happy to make them, and good luck on your practice final. Please ask me any questions. All right, talk to you later. Bye.